Hi, everybody. My name is Vivian Schiller, and I am the Executive Director of Aspen Digital. We are coming to you via this Zoom, but also on YouTube, on CNN live stream, and Yahoo Finance live stream. We're so glad to have you with us for this first public program with members of the Facebook Oversight Board on the day after the historic decision on the removal of Donald J. Trump from Facebook's platforms. If you're with us now, I am sure you are aware of the context that the president was suspended from Facebook after posting encouragement and support to the insurrectionists who were storming Congress as they were getting ready to count and certify the 2020 electoral votes, which is a constitutionally mandated process. 5 people died and many others were injured as a result. After first temporarily suspending the president, Facebook then declared the suspension indefinite. Make note of that word. We're going to come back to it later. And then turned the case over to the Facebook Oversight Board, asking the body to assess whether it made the right decision and asking them also generally their views about the suspensions when the user is a significant political leader. As you know, but as a reminder, the Facebook Oversight Board was originated and funded by Facebook, but is now set up as an independent, irrevocable trust separate from Facebook. It is set up to make binding decisions on takedowns that are sent to it for appeal. And more recently, that mandate has expanded to posts that are up if there's a question about whether that post should come down. Yesterday, the Facebook Oversight Board came out with its very highly anticipated decision, to say the least. The Oversight Board ruled to uphold the suspension, but they referred the case back to Facebook, demanding clarification and giving them 6 months to do so. I'll say no more as I want the members to speak for themselves. So they will be up in just a second. But first, a quick bit of housekeeping. We're going to take questions from you, the audience, during the last half of this program. To ask a question at any point, you can do so now during the program. Those on Zoom can submit your question using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you are watching on live stream, you can email us at aspendigital@aspeninstitute.org. That's aspendigital@aspeninstitute.org. Please include your name and affiliation if you feel comfortable doing so, as that can provide helpful context, but it's not mandatory. A disclosure: Aspen Digital receives funding from Facebook, not the Oversight Board, Facebook proper, but we have not worked with Facebook in any way on this program. In fact, they learned the details of the program alongside the public. We maintain full editorial control over this and all our other programming at all times. I should also note that we invited someone from Facebook to join this program to respond to the Oversight Board decisions and the comments that will be made on this program, but they have declined. Okay, let's get started. We're going to start first with the Facebook Oversight members. We have 4 of them. Let me mention who they are quickly. Jamal Green is co-chair of the Oversight Board and professor of law at Columbia Law School. His scholarship focuses on constitutional rights adjudication, as well as the structure of legal and constitutional argument. Ronaldo Lemos is a lawyer specializing in technology, intellectual property, media, and public policy. He is a partner with a leading law firm in Brazil and has 20 years of experience in the private and public sectors. Julie Awano is executive director of Internet Sans Frontières, an organization which defends digital rights and access to the internet. She is also a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. And finally, John Samples is vice president at the Cato Institute. He founded and now directs Cato's Center for Representative Government, which studies freedom of speech, the First Amendment, and other aspects of American political institutions. So welcome to all of you. And I will begin with my first question, Jamal, to you as one of the co-chairs of the Facebook Oversight Board. The Facebook Oversight Board upheld the suspension for now, but your ruling strikes me, at least, as more procedural than principled. You effectively toss this back to Facebook. So the question is, why not propose the very standards that you're asking Facebook to come up with? Why not propose those yourselves?
Sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks to all of you for engaging here. The first thing I'll say is just by way of kind of disclaimer and additional information, I think it'll be important for people to read the opinion itself and not just rely on whatever we say about it. We want to make sure that our opinions do speak for themselves. But I think it's also good to, of course, provide some additional context. To your question, Vivian, I don't know that I would, and maybe this is a lawyer's answer, but I wouldn't say there's a binary between procedural and principled. I think a procedure is an important part of legal decision making. The question of why not apply the standards that the board wants Facebook to apply directly, well, that has something to do with the mandate of the board and the role that it plays vis-a-vis Facebook. The board's job is to make sure that Facebook is doing its job. And its job means making decisions according to its rules, making decisions that are in compliance with its values, making decisions that are in compliance with the international human rights norms that Facebook is committed to applying. And the board's job is not to make decisions about users in the first instance. Facebook has a responsibility to its users and to its community and to the broader public to make its own decisions and come up with its own procedures as a company. And our job is to review them and to make sure that they're consistent and compliant with other norms. So that's the short of it, which is to say that it is procedural in a sense. I'll say that as someone who studies free expression and as a US scholar studies the First Amendment, one of the things that is very important in First Amendment law and also important in international human rights law is that decisions be made in ways that are not arbitrary. That's part of the substantive law that we apply in free expression law. And so that's part of our mandate, is to make sure that decisions are made consistently. It's not to, in the first instance, decide what sanctions to apply to particular users.
So when you sent it back to Facebook, you basically, and you can correct me if I've got this wrong, you've basically given them 6 months to come up with those standards. What happens at the end of those 6 months?
At the end of the 6 months, well, it doesn't have to be 6 months. Is the first thing to say. So yeah. Facebook could decide more quickly than that. But our expectation is that Facebook listens to what the board says. It's committed to doing so, and it has so far. It has complied with the board's instructions in previous cases, and we expect it to live up to its commitment. So at the end of 6 months, Facebook will make a decision about a particular sanction, and we'll see what happens from there.
And are they bound to do what you asked? I know that decisions about takedowns and leave ups are binding. Is what you asked for them to basically examine their rules and come up with these clarifications? Are they bound by that? Alan Rusbridger, I noticed, mentioned that they were bound by it in his piece in The Guardian this morning.
Well, Facebook put a question to the Oversight Board and said that they would abide by what the Oversight Board said in response to that question. The question was whether Facebook's indefinite suspension of Donald Trump was something that it should keep in place. Now, our answer to that question is no. They need a different kind of penalty, either one of their existing penalties, which is either take down content or have a specified time period, or delete the account if necessary. And so that's what they need to. We've said that their current penalty is not adequate, and they need to do something different. And so, since they've committed in the way they've committed to our other decisions to abide by what we say, that's the expectation.
Julie, let me turn to you. There were so many responses across the board to the decision yesterday. To say that there was no consistency is the understatement of the year. But there were many people who were disappointed, saying a lot of people praised the decision and the way that you framed it. But others were disappointed, saying you abdicated your responsibility by sending it back to Facebook. Margaret Sullivan, the Washington Post columnist, called the board, quote, a high-priced fig leaf meant to avoid real accountability. Joan Donovan said that Facebook paid tens of millions of dollars for a non-decision, is the way she put it, because the Facebook Oversight Board punted the Trump decision back to them. Now, I know these criticisms are largely directed at Facebook, not so much the board necessarily, but do you think that is a fair assessment? And if not, why?
I think that those who are criticizing Facebook for its lack of accountability, and those who are concerned with the huge power that the company, and particularly its CEO, has on our discourse online, should actually praise a decision that, on the one hand, recognizes the exceptional events that happened earlier this year on January the 6th, and but also refuses to endorse an arbitrary decision. The arbitrary is exactly what we don't want a powerful company like Facebook to get involved in. That said, I don't necessarily agree that there was no decision. I think there was. If you read the opinion, you will see that the board has put out clear guidelines for a company like Facebook on how it should apply international human rights standards when faced with potential violations by powerful and influential users. They will see that, those who will read the decision will also see that we are saying that all users matter on the platform, and that it's not because you're a head of state that you have more rights to basically spew hate, fake, and violate community standards freely on in the name of newsworthiness, for instance. On the contrary, what we're doing in that decision is to remind Facebook that it has responsibility to protect public safety, and it should do so in a way that's respectful of international human rights. And we're also telling influential users, political leaders, but not only, that they have a responsibility to promote peaceful messages, to protect public safety, given the audience that they have. And that's what we did by calling upon the UN Rabat Plan of Action, which was adopted to protect public safety against discrimination, against hate, and so many wrong things. So what I also want to say, and that probably we haven't insisted that much in the public conversation so far about the decision, is that first of all, it's the first time that the company has provided a thorough history of an account or a page behavior on its platform. And this is extremely important, because what have we learned? We have learned that Facebook has had to take actions 5 times already on the account of the former president. We have also learned that the company says it has never applied the newsworthiness exception, which basically means that they think the content published by political leaders is important for political debate and public debate, and therefore should be left up. We have learned that they haven't done so in the case of Trump. What we also think is important to remember with the decision is that the board doesn't shy away from asking very tough questions. We've seen that we have asked 46 questions to the company, and the company has refused to answer 9 of them, 2 partially and 7 completely. And the ones that the company refused to answer to are precisely related to what happened before January the 6th. What was the context before January the 6th? And our decision says that you cannot make such an important decision, that's such a serious decision for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, without the adequate context. I think this is important to remember, especially when we criticize the decision.
Let's stick with those 46 questions for a minute. I'm going to turn over now to you, Ronaldo. As Julie mentioned, the 46 questions, Facebook declined to answer some of them, including what happened before. But it strikes me, and you can correct me if I've got this wrong, that they also refused to answer questions about sort of the scope and the reach of the posts, Trump's posts, and others. One of the recommendations in the document you published yesterday reads as follows. It says, this should be an open, this is what you're saying to Facebook, this should be an open reflection on the design and policy choices that Facebook has made that may enable its platform to be abused, excuse me. Is that not really just sort of poetic language for wanting them to address the underlying algorithms that impact the reach and scope of messages like Trump? And how can the board, can the board compel Facebook to answer questions that get to its underlying technology? Do you have that oversight? And if not, how can you cure the disease if you're not allowed to consider the symptoms?
Thank you, Vivian. Those are all very important questions. And of course, a lot of people that look to the Oversight Board and basically have criticism regarding its structure and our work actually demand that the board could have more powers. So more powers to enable rules, more powers to basically interfere with Facebook's activities. So that is a typical type of criticism that we hear all the time. And some of the articles that you just mentioned, I think they go precisely in that direction. But the limited powers that the Oversight Board have over Facebook, they are actually quite a lot. So our effective powers are to decide whether a specific piece of content should be left up or taken down, and the reasons for that decision to be made. And I think like in this particular case, you can see already how that is actually an exercise of power that can lead to change in regards to Facebook. So basically, when we ask those questions about algorithms and how Facebook actually prioritize content, or sometimes even super spread misinformation, this is precisely in the path of change, even if it's within the limited powers that the Oversight Board has. So that conversation, it has started. That conversation is, of course, in the public eye right now. That conversation is inside the board, of course. And of course, we take these contexts and we take these elements in every decision that the board makes. So for those who would like the Oversight Board to have an immediate and effective impact, I think you can see that already happening. And this decision is very clear. So just to recap a little bit of some of the points that Jamal asked, if you can sum up what the board has decided in this particular case in one short sentence, that would be, we are asking Facebook, we are first upholding Facebook decisions on January 7th. That was a correct decision. But we are also asking Facebook that within 6 months, it comes up with very clear rules in regards, for instance, to influential users. And not only come up with those rules, but apply those rules to everyone once they are defined. So that is the ask of this particular board. And for those who are looking into change, I think that is a very important ask for a company like Facebook. And we, as Julie mentioned, expect that Facebook keeps its track of respecting and applying the board's decisions. And in 6 months, if that happens, and we hope it will, that is change. And I think that change is very positive.
Have you heard from anybody at Facebook in response to your what you put out yesterday?
Well, we've heard from the public announcement of Nick Clegg, in which he welcomed the work that the board has been doing. And it was a very positive response so far. So the position on Nick Clegg, the one that I saw personally, I think it was a very positive response to what we have decided.
Before I let you go and go to John, though, I just want to come back one more time to the technology, because I understand what you're asking of Facebook. You're asking them to clarify, just to summarize, you put it very well, to be much clearer about their rules, about the penalty, so that it doesn't, so that these decisions, don't feel and they're not arbitrary. But do you think you can effectively do your work and effectively make informed decisions without understanding not just the stated terms of service and the rules, which absolutely are important, but the nature, the means by which posts on Facebook, whether they're from a Donald Trump or a less famous user, how those travel, how they are targeted, how much reach they have? Do you feel like you can really effectively fulfill your role without addressing those issues? That's still for you, Ronaldo.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were asking John.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I dozed off. Can you please rephrase?
Yeah.
The
I
last
just
portion
want
of
to
the
stick with the
question?
technology because I know that's your particular area of expertise. That's why
Sure.
I'm asking, which is, do you think you can, without understanding the underlying technology and the algorithmically targeted means by which messages are spread and targeted and their reach, do you think it's great that you are demanding these rules, and that's all fine, but do you think you can really effectively do your job as an oversight board without understanding and without asking for clarification or getting under the hood of how Facebook effectively operates?
Absolutely, Vivian. And this is one of my personal concerns, and it's definitely something that I've been paying attention to since I took my position in the board. And that is a very important question to be asked. And of course, that has a deep implications for every decision that the board makes as well, because context here matters. So when you look into the Rabat plan, one of the key elements for making decisions is precisely to consider context. And of course, technology here is part of that context. So if you look into a certain piece of content and you realize that that piece of content is part of a massive disinformation campaign, sometimes very well funded, that exploits, for instance, specific responses that an algorithm has in regards to content, of course, that matters. That is not your typical citizen exercising, irregular free speech, but that might imply, for instance, deception, because that might be a piece of content that doesn't show you exactly what is going on in terms of how that content interacts with the algorithms. So context is fundamental here, and you can expect that the Oversight Board will keep asking those questions and will keep looking into what is the context that technology and algorithms provide. And in my personal view, of course, I don't intend here to represent the whole board, it's my personal opinion. These are some of the fundamental questions that have to be asked, and they will continue to be asked, at least by me.
Thank you, Ronaldo. John Tamples, let me turn to you. You know, it was sort of remarkable, I think, probably for all of you as well. I don't know that you could have anticipated the kind of like frenzy waiting for the decision come down, and the frenzy when it came down, and everybody reading this, you know, reading your report and responding to it in real time. Ironically, not on Facebook so much, but on Twitter. It was, you know, it harkens back to journalists standing outside the Supreme Court, waiting to report on a finding or waiting for white smoke to come from the Vatican. But the fact is, you know, the Facebook Oversight Board is not a Supreme Court. And this isn't a legal process. This is a business decision. It's a business process, effectively. So what do you say to those who claim that Facebook is trying to sort of put a legal gloss over the whole thing, when it actually, in the end of the day, comes back to the decisions of Facebook as a company and ultimately to one man, Mark Zuckerberg?
Well, I think it's interesting, the entire setup of the Oversight Board and its relationship to Facebook. If you look at the Oversight Board's charter, its bylaws, all of which are available publicly, you can Google it. What you see is that our responsibilities are not to the business side of Facebook. Our responsibilities are laid out fairly clearly. We're supposed to judge Facebook's content moderation by Facebook values, by its community standards, which was relevant yesterday, and also by what I would call international human rights norms. So in that sense, Facebook has taken the chance, I think, to appoint a board to help them with the content moderation, to give some legitimacy to the content moderation, but it is not set out a board that is, has any business responsibilities. We're not there to maximize shareholder value. We're not given that charge.
You and Julie both have mentioned over the course of the last few minutes about international human rights law. So I want to come back to that. I'm going to ask one more question, then I want to bring in our other guests. I maybe will turn to Jamal for this one as our resident constitutional expert here. But your talking points all lean very heavily on international human rights law as a justification, and that human rights law probably it generally is read as a preference for allowing speech, but there's also a responsibility to protect the public from harms. And we know in particular around Trump's speech that in particular, underrepresented communities have been particularly harmed by Trump's speech, which then, flows from him to his followers and has been, as we've seen, can then flow into the real world. So can you explain how that consideration and how human rights law guided your decision here and why?
So let me just first push back just a little bit on the premise that free expression is not as protected under international human rights law. I think this is the subject of some disagreement among scholars, right? But I think Americans who are familiar with First Amendment law often sort of assign to anything foreign, like the non-protection of speech. And I think that's not an accurate reflection of human rights law when it comes to free expression. So Article 19, which is the most directly relevant resource in international human rights law, is quite speech protective and only allows limitations on speech under very specific circumstances. The First Amendment is also quite speech protective, but also allows some limitations on speech under specific circumstances. When it comes to marginalized communities and how that had any influence here, when you read the opinion, for those of you who haven't, there is some discussion of a minority view, and minority just in the numerical sense, on the board that wanted the opinion to say more about the dignitary harm that former President Trump has inflicted on members of minority communities over time. It's a minority position, not because the board necessarily took a position or rejected that, but because the majority of the board did not see that as necessary to the decision, that kind of discussion as necessary to the decision. The decision was taken on the basis of actions that were profoundly anti-democratic, and that the attack on the Capitol was an attack on us all. And so that was sufficient for Facebook to make the decision it made, and that was the board's decision. And again, just going back to the role of international human rights law there, part of the reason the board's mandate is to focus on international human rights law is because Facebook is while it's situated in Northern California, it is a company whose users are around the world. It has almost 3 billion users around the world, only a small minority of whom are American. And so the standards have to be standards that apply everywhere. And the Article 19 and the Rabat Plan of Action were taken into consideration in deciding how much what the particular harm of the speech at issue might have been here and how much it could be limited.
All right, I want to bring on now our two other guests who are joining us. And just as a reminder to everybody, we're going to get to your questions very soon. So please continue to drop them into the Q&A section. Or again, if you're not on the Zoom, you can email us at aspendigital, one word, at aspeninstitute.org. I know that's a mouthful, but aspendigital at aspeninstitute.org. So I now want to welcome two more of our panelists. We have with us Faiza Patel. She is co-director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. She is a well-recognized expert on issues of national security and counterterrorism, and has contributed to media outlets from the New York Times to the Post, The Economist, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, NPR, and so on. We also have with us Henry Olsen. He is the Washington Post columnist and senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He previously served as president of the Commonwealth Foundation, and was vice president and director of National Research Initiative at the American Enterprise Institute. So Henry, I'm going to start with you. You wrote an op-ed. One of the reasons we were looking forward to having you on is you wrote an op-ed a while back that Trump should be let back on the platform. You made the case for that in the Washington Post. I think it was the beginning of February. Mm-hmm. You had a second post yesterday in the wake of the Oversight Board ruling that came down with a slightly different view. You wrote, his posts that day made while rioters were in the Capitol building could clearly be interpreted as supporting their violent behavior. I think the Facebook Oversight Board obviously agrees with you, but what's changed? Why did you before think he should be let back on, and now you maybe are questioning that?
No, I'm not really questioning that. I didn't make that. I wrote the February piece in the context that he was no longer president, that there was no longer a clear and present danger that he would use the power of the Oval Office to either directly through the use of national security personnel or the military, or through his bully pulpit being able to be the president, rally what would be in effect a assault on democratic institutions. And so since he was no longer there in February, I thought he should be let back on because he's now a private citizen. I still believe that, but I think in light of the Facebook board's decision yesterday, the standards by which he can be allowed back on and which would then apply to other similar cases need to be elucidated by Facebook. And yesterday's piece was designed to say that as Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook decide what those policies will be, both with respect to the president and in other similar cases, he ought to lean heavily on an American-style First Amendment view that would make only clear and present dangers to direct, insightful speech, and I cited the Brandenburg versus Ohio case, should lead to banning. Other than that, political speech is inherently contentious. It is inherently passionate. And as I pointed out in the piece, often intentionally uses martial imagery. And I think the context of politics means that Facebook ought to steer very clear of censoring people, even those who create widely held passions for and against that could motivate people of ill mind to commit violence. Otherwise, we would have to say that a Facebook in 1857 should eliminate abolitionist speech because it could encourage John Y. Brown to go attack Harper's Ferry and try and create a slave insurrection. I don't think we want to go there.
So you agree that the Facebook Oversight Board should seek clarity about the rules with Facebook, but your message basically to Facebook is that they should lean heavily towards, once clarifying those rules, reinstating Trump. If I understand that correctly. Henry? Oh, I think we lost him. Okay.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
There you go. Okay, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have an unstable internet connection.
No worries.
That I had expected the board to establish a standard on its own. It decided to give that back to Facebook in the first instance. So yesterday's column was basically a message to Facebook of, if you really believe in the American First Amendment, you need to have policies that reflect that. And that means a very wide berth should.
All right, I want to come back to that in a minute. I want to turn to Faiza now, but I want to come back to that and to ask you questions about potential harms. But let me turn to Faiza first. You wrote our new platform of choice for sharing everything. Of course, not so new is Twitter. You wrote yesterday, Facebook got more than they bargained for in turning this over to the Oversight Board, which took Facebook to task. So how so, and what did you think about the decision by the Oversight Board? Faiza? Henry, are you with us?
Now
I'm unmuted now.
Oh, there
Sorry.
you are. Okay.
Yeah,
Hi,
sorry,
Faiza.
the classic. I got to unmute myself. It's terrible.
Happens to the best of us.
I think that, when Facebook was setting up and designing this board, it was quite interesting to watch their process, right? Because they were obviously trying to channel the ways in which the board would operate. And I know it's independent and they set up the trust and all that, but it was very carefully designed in order to get some questions to the board and yet sort of preserve Facebook's prerogative on a whole host of issues. And I think one of the things that's been interesting to watch is to see, the oversight board kind of push back against those boundaries. And in particular, I guess I want to highlight two things that really struck me as really important. So one was, and Julie pointed this out, which was the list of questions, right? You asked these 47 questions, and we're very clear about telling the public which questions Facebook didn't answer. And those questions were super important, right? Because they went to the point that you raised, Vivian, around the algorithms and the technology and what role Facebook itself had played in amplifying the speech that it then took down, on January 6th and 7th. And then the second part, which I thought was interesting, was trying to get at this idea of what is the political influence on Facebook, right? Did anybody from Trump's team call up Facebook and say, hey, you got to let our guy back on the platform? I mean, these are important questions that Facebook has been avoiding and has sort of been trying to gloss over. And I think it's really great to see the board kind of pushing back on those issues. And I think that the sort of coming back to this issue of technology and the board's recommendation that Facebook should really, and I think the open reflection was a nice turn of phrase on how its own algorithms and its own policies actually amplify the kind of harm that it then tries to constrain with content moderation is really right where it's at. I'd be surprised if Facebook did anything substantive on that, but I hope to be pleasantly surprised on that.
So your hope is that they decide what in the end, at the end of 6 months?
Well, I think the 6 month issue is really related to how they respond to Trump, right? Whether they do it on the basis, how they apply their currently available remedies to Trump, and the indefinite suspension isn't one of them. So, that's a different issue. I think the overall, I believe Facebook has 30 days, if I'm not wrong, to respond publicly to recommendations by the board. And obviously, none of these are not things that are going to happen in 30 days. But I think at that end of that 30-day period, we'll get at least a little bit of a sense of how Facebook takes these very important questions into account.
Henry, let me come back to you because I hear your point about the Facebook erring on the side of free speech and reinstating Trump. But Trump is still very much a public figure. He has tens of millions of people in the United States believe that he is the rightful winner of the 2020 election. And they still listen to him intently. Is he not still a risk because of those very same people who, many of the same people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th could be incited by Trump? And we know the real world harms that has brought. So how do you square your decision about that it was right for them to take him down after January 6th, but now that he's not president, yet still highly, intensely influential, that now it's okay? Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, look, political speech carries risk. The person who drove from Illinois with a semi-automatic weapon to murder 30 Republican members of Congress, which he was averted from only because one of the members was in House leadership and had security there to return fire. Had Steve Scalise not been present, 30 Republican members would have been murdered by this person. That is an unfortunate risk of having free speech. And I don't think that limiting people who you don't like, who have influence, is the appropriate way to govern a platform that seeks to be devoted to free speech. And Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook have clearly stated they are devoted to free speech. They stated that when they established the Oversight Board. And if you start saying, well, this person's too hateful or this person's too influential, that ultimately becomes something in the eye of the beholder. And then you no longer have a platform that is dedicated to free speech. You have a platform that will either be bandied about by political purposes, depending on the pressures of the day, to suppress the opponents of the people who hold political power, or you will have a partisan entity that seeks to suppress speech that it disagrees with. There's a word for that. That's a publisher. And if Mark Zuckerberg wants Facebook to become a publisher, then he should remove any Section 230 protections and act as any private publisher, the publisher of the New Republic or the publisher of the National Review, and people should understand Facebook in those terms.
Faiza, your response? Faiza?
I was trying to follow instructions to stay on mute when not speaking.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. You know, look, I'm very, very devoted to free speech. So I think I have a lot of sympathy for what Henry is saying over here, in the sense that I think there should be a presumption that political speech should be allowed on the platform, and that there should be only very limited instances in which that speech should be removed. But I do think that, you know, it's a bit misleading to kind of accept Mark Zuckerberg's claim that Facebook is about free speech. Facebook is about free speech for some people. Facebook is about free speech for people like Donald Trump or other influential people. On the other hand, I think a lot of marginalized communities, a lot of people of color are routinely kicked off Facebook or had their posts removed or their speech suppressed because of Facebook's rules. And I think the rules actually by far favor the powerful as opposed to the powerless. And I think that's the piece of Facebook's structure which I find the most disturbing, which is that it is in some sense a series of cascading discretionary decisions about, you know, compare, for example, the rules on hate speech versus the rules on terrorist content. There are really severe bans on what they call terrorist content. And when you come to hate speech, the rules are much more nuanced. There's a lot more levels. There's a lot less enforcement, it seems. I think these are the kinds of discrepancies that I'm much more worried about. I'm much less worried about Trump having a platform on Facebook or not, because I think he has so many other outlets, than I am about sort of the ability of ordinary citizens to express views that are across a broad spectrum of ideas and ideology.
Well, many, of course, would argue that the actual direct impact with the calls and with support of Trump, the call to kill members of Congress, to go after those who do not support Trump, would warrant and the continuing refusal of Trump to acknowledge that would warrant that this might trump small t, those free speech provisions in the same way that terrorist rhetoric would. I want to now open it up to your questions. So, I will do my best here to with the help of the team here at Aspen, to select those questions, and I will try my best to direct them to the appropriate people. But I would ask any of our panelists to just jump in if they have something to say. So this first one comes in from Ana Rosa Alves, a reporter with the Brazilian newspaper O Globo. A lot of critics say that Facebook's algorithms purposely promote polarizing rhetoric to increase their ad revenue. Therefore, unless their business model is revamped, all actions to tackle disinformation at best will have a palliative effect. To what extent do you think that is true? I will turn this over to members of the Facebook Oversight Board, and happy to see who would like to take this. I'm having trouble seeing my screen and reading the questions at the same time. Ronaldo Lemos, how about I turn this one over to you?
Thank you, Vivian. And thank you, Ana Rosa, for asking that question. So as I mentioned before, of course, algorithms matter. And of course, they are part of the context in every analysis that the board will be doing. So we are talking here about a platform that uses algorithms, sophisticated algorithms to decide how they are basically lined up in your news feed and so on. So that those questions, Ana Rosa, they really matter. In this particular case, of course, we asked questions about that to Facebook, and those questions were not answered. But even so, we had all the elements that we needed to make a decision in this particular case. So going forward, this is something that, as I mentioned before, is part of our concerns and is something that we are looking into. And of course, it has repercussions to what we were previously debating here in terms of free speech on Facebook and what content gets amplified and what content gets not amplified. And sometimes there are political speeches that are overly amplified, and there are other legitimate speeches and that might not have the same treatment. That's why the board has asked Facebook to decide clear rules within 6 months and apply those clear rules uniformly in regards to all the users. So this is one of the things that the board is actually pushing Facebook to do. And of course, this is something in terms of the algorithms that we'll be looking forward and keep looking going forward.
Thank you. John Samples, I think you wanted to weigh in here.
Yes, this question about the design of the platform and other issues was not reached in this case in the decision itself. So it's not part of the decision. It's not binding on Facebook. I would say that in general, I think the policy advice we give them, while it's not required, is actually very much in their interest. And I suspect they will want to do many of these things. One of the things we advise them to do is to go back and look at the period leading up to the election and to assess the responsibility of the platform in this regard. And indeed, I think there's some evidence already that we've seen in the public sphere that they have been doing that. I read a report that had been posted and then leaked at Facebook. And what I would say is there's another side to this, right? We're assuming that this is an easy question, that Facebook just does the right thing. What I found from that leaked report was that this is actually a quite complicated question. Facebook does a lot of things in designing the platform and in governing the platform that are not known and have enormous power, right? In other words, not to suppress speech necessarily or remove accounts from the platform, but from just affecting the interrelationship of speakers and their listeners, or expression and how much expression is being heard. The question of friction that is one of those things. That is, Facebook has the ability to make it harder for speeches, for expression to be heard more broadly. And, you can see why that might be thought to be a good thing in a situation where violence is possible and so on. But it's all friction is, and putting it in there, or similar kinds of things that I don't know about, are also in the wrong hands and for the wrong reasons. Can have profound effects on the debate and deliberation in a country prior to an election or prior to judgments about policy. So I think, yes, we have recommended they look at this, but we also have to recognize that the question of design is a very complicated question, and one that where regulation, internal or external, holds the possibilities of both good and bad effects from a democratic point of view.
All right, next question comes from Shireen Mitchell with Stop Online Violence Against Women. Her question is, if the charge of the Oversight Board is to consider human rights in the context of content on the platform, why are the cases reviewed by the board limited? There seems to be only a focus on high-profile cases, but the day-to-day user harms and the connection to the terms of service or community standards seem to be less important and leave marginalized users in harm's way. Deplatforming groups like Proud Boys, people like Alex Jones, after the harm has been inflicted, seems to suggest safety is a secondary concern over speech when these cases made it to the board. Isn't this the opposite of the charge of the board? Jamil, how about I turn this over to you?
Sorry, I don't know if you had asked someone to respond, but I'm happy to respond.
Go ahead.
Someone...
Go ahead.
Okay,
Go ahead,
thank
Julie.
you. I would say that we don't only have high-profile cases. If you look at the history of the cases we have published, we've published cases related to religious minority voices in India. We've published cases related to the Muslim population in Myanmar. We've made decisions in the case of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So in doing so, we looked not only at policies related to hate or policies related to dangerous organizations, but we're also looking at other community standards applied by the company. And I think doing this allows us also to, have an idea, a clearer idea of how the over-enforcement of community standards contribute to the silencing of marginalized voices. In our latest decision that was published right before the one we're discussing, it was related to religious minority in India who were complaining against the exclusion policy practiced by the current Indian government. And we did ask questions in that case to Facebook with regards to whether or not it chooses to over-enforce its policies against groups that are not favored by the current government. And I think it's important to bear this in mind, that there is over-enforcement of policies, not only the most prominent one, particularly hate speech, for instance, or dangerous organizations, but there are other community standards that are used basically to over-enforce and to silence voices, and we're paying extreme attention to that too in the selection of cases that we're working on.
Okay, Faiza, I think you wanted to maybe jump in here.
I hadn't had my hand up, but I think that what Julie said is exactly right. I mean, the board has taken on a range of cases. This is clearly the most high profile case of a super user, super spreader, whatever you want to call him. And I do think that the point that Julie made about over enforcement of community standards in certain contexts is really critical, because the reality is all we know as the public about how Facebook is enforcing its standards is what Facebook has chosen to tell us. Their transparency reports have gotten better and better over the years, but at the same time, they are the company's decision about what we need to know. And I think there's a lot more that we need to know to understand the impact of content moderation across different communities and in different parts of the world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Faiza. Question, I'll give this one to you, Jamal. This comes from Liam Odell. There were over 8,000 public comments submitted in this case. What was the process behind examining all those comments, and what insight did the Oversight Board gain from these responses? And then I'll add a corollary to that, just because my own question is, and how much of an impact did those comments have on your decision? And can you point to any in particular?
So in terms of process, there were almost 10,000 comments. So I think it was 9,666. That's by orders of magnitude more than the board has received in prior cases. The board does have a very highly competent and effective staff that helps to curate some of the comments so that we have a manageable number to look at. But in any event, the board looked at a very large number of comments. I won't just to in terms of protecting the integrity of the deliberation, won't get into the specific comments. The comments are available to be read by anyone. They're linked from the opinion itself, so anyone
All of
can
the
look at
comments? Sorry, all of the
all of
comments are
all of
linked?
the comments are linked. I believe all of them are linked directly from the opinion. So one can read the comments and see what people decided to submit. But the board read the comments, took them seriously. I think it's safe to say that there was deliberation that involved some of the comments. I think Alan might have mentioned that in his op-ed, but I won't get into the specifics, but the board always takes the comments it receives very seriously. And I can say that in prior cases, not just this case, but other cases as well, the comments we've received have been valuable to my own thinking.
Okay, thank you. This next question is from Jay Wright. His question is, if dealing with one decision takes months, how will the company and this board ever deal with policing the actual volume of posts shared? I mean, it needs to be said, this is now not Jay's words, but the sort of the end run around Facebook Oversight Board decisions is that you're dealing with posts, not ideas, right? So Donald Trump's incitement of the big lie can be seen over the line, but other notorious users and allies, as one of our other questioners pointed out, like Bannon, were left on Facebook spreading those same lies about the 2020 election. So we've learned since the Trump ban that Mark Zuckerberg had a different set of rules for right-wing extremists, which allowed posts praising conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones to stay on. So how does the Oversight Board hope to affect change and overall and impact overall policy and not just tweak around the margins?
I can say a little bit.
Go ahead.
I can say a little bit more about this as well, which is, of course, the board only takes a small number of cases. That's a small number of the cases it receives. The board has received lots and lots, many tens of thousands of appeals at this point. And those appeals only represent a small percentage of people who are aggrieved in some way by things that Facebook does or doesn't do, right? So, of course, one can't change a large company or a large culture through a very small number of individual case decisions. But the opinions matter, and the case selection process matters. The cases are selected on the basis of their likelihood of being repeated across the platform, the impact the decision might have. So we try to take cases that are representative of problems that we see at the company. And in implementing the decisions, the company has committed to taking those the decisions of the board seriously. So just in the way that courts don't take, not to press this analogy too far, but just in the way that courts don't decide every issue in an individual case, and precedents matter, and people look to those precedents to figure out how to resolve future cases. The same is true of the board. I'll also say that in the recommendations that the board makes, that's another important part of the board's work, and those recommendations are forward-looking, they're systematic, they're designed to be systematic, and Facebook has an obligation to respond to them publicly. And so that's another point of leverage for the board to try to make change.
All right, the next question comes from Elizabeth Meyer. She's adjunct associate law professor at American University in DC. Her question, given that the board is made up of mostly of non-US experts who come from different legal, contextual, and historical backgrounds than the strong tradition of liberty and freedom, this is her question, of speech in the US, how does this influence the outcome of the debate on a US company? I might ask one of our non-US experts here who may want to challenge the tradition of liberty and free speech tradition in other countries. So Julie, would you like to take this one? Julie? Ronaldo?
Yes, I think Julie is back, but go
Okay.
ahead, Julie. Oh,
Sorry, I had a technical problem. I didn't even hear the question. I'm sorry.
That's right. Go ahead, Ronaldo. We'll come back to you with a
okay,
different question.
no problem. So I think, Vivian, this is a very important point. I think like the impact that the oversight board is looking to have, of course, it takes into consideration primarily, for instance, how human rights principles actually embed and have been embedding for a long time principles of free speech. So I read with great interest like Henry Olsen's op-ed just yesterday at the Washington Post. And one point that strikes me is that Facebook's community standards is already heavily influenced by the First Amendment in the United States. So if you read about how the rules of the community standards are actually designed and how they are actually written, you will see that there's a lot of overlap and resemblance, even with the language of decisions that historically have been taken in regards to the First Amendment. So that is already part of the considerations that the board actually used to make decisions. But more than that, there is an international body of human rights principles, which actually come from treaties in which the United States themselves are part. And I think that is also very relevant because these treaties, they are applied across the globe, and they're applied, for instance, for countries like Brazil and others that are also signatories to those treaties. And sometimes, if you look at the community standards of Facebook, they're much more pro-free speech than a lot of national laws. So if you look to the situation of free speech in the world today, and if you look into Freedom House's reports, Brazil, for instance, is having a moment in which we are declining in terms of the guarantees that you need to have in terms of free speech. And in that situation, Facebook community standards are positioned even higher than national laws in many cases. So I think the commitment of the Oversight Board to basically look into human rights treaties and how freedom of speech is protected over those treaties, and also into applying the community standards. And I think that is extremely relevant to the way we are looking to this problem from a global perspective, because that is a point. The Oversight Board, it has to deal with cases not only from the United States, but also cases from everywhere in the globe. And I think the looking into the community standards and the human rights treaties, I think it's a principled and normative way to approach that problem.
Okay, on this, sticking with the same question, John and then Jamal.
Thanks. I agree with everything Ronaldo said, but I wanted to add a little bit more. Throughout the decision, we note at various times similarity to U.S. First Amendment law, but it's also, I want to say why I think this is an exciting time for freedom of speech and the idea of freedom of speech, which is that, yet Facebook is beyond borders. It is a global institution. And even in the United States, the First Amendment applies to the public sector, not to the private sector. As part of its global reach, Facebook agreed to be guided by international human rights norms, including free speech. And that's an American principle that consent by a business to whatever is an important idea in the United States. What will happen, I think, in the future, and I think will ultimately be good, is that the great authority that Brandenburg, that free speech, that broad, robust free speech protections have in the United States will not transfer easily abroad. Now, this is not bad for the following reason. What it means that free speech will have to go forward on its own terms. We will have to make the argument, people like Henry and I that believe in the strong free speech, that it's not because it's in the US Constitution, but rather because robust free speech protections are the best policy for people everywhere. It's natural rights or whatever, but it's the best outcomes too. The societies that don't do that are the ones that aren't going to be thriving. Now, true, there are risks, but what history says, I think, is that we've reached this conclusion about free speech as humanity precisely because it's a very workable policy. So it's an exciting time in which we will have to go back and not rely on the authority of a century of Supreme Court decisions, but rather find out what was the real arguments there, what is the benefits of free speech, and make that case throughout the world. I think it's, this board and this the spread of Facebook can be the beginning of a really golden age for freedom of speech if we make our arguments and we're tough and persistent in making those arguments, as I know Henry will be and everyone on the board will be.
Jamal.
I just want to very briefly just amplify something that Ronaldo said that also touches on something I said earlier about the distinction between national laws and international law. And sometimes these things do get conflated, particularly in American free speech debates, as just foreign law, as a sort of unified thing that's not American. But international law standards are not the same thing as the particular national laws of other jurisdictions. And there is no doubt that US free expression law looks very different from free expression law in many other countries. But the gap between US free speech law and international human rights law as it pertains to free expression is not quite the same kind of gap. It's a complicated question, but it is important to separate out those things.
The next question comes from somebody who chose not to share their name. The question is, well, it starts with a statement. Facebook is an international platform. Certainly, we know that's true. It has billions of users. Not all of them are in the United States. What are the implications of this decision worldwide, if any? Will world leaders, or I think the expression, what was it that you used in your document, influential individuals, I think it was, be expected to petition the Facebook Oversight Board for or against, or petition Facebook for that matter within the next 6 months? What might you think the implications of that will be? And I realize the Facebook Oversight Board members, this is out of your jurisdiction, but we would welcome your comment, or Henry or Faiza as well.
That I think is obviously the question, right? Because we've seen that Facebook has increasingly taken action against political leaders, and so the other platforms, that people have become a little more bold, if you will, over the last few months, I would say, in acting against political leaders. I think it sends a really important signal, though, which is in contravention to sort of the newsworthiness. We will allow elected officials to say what they want on our platform line that Facebook had previously taken, which is to say that, the board's findings on sort of high reach accounts are recommendations at this point. And so Facebook has to come up with a policy on that. But at least I think it sets the bar for saying, it's not open season. You cannot say whatever it is that you please on the platform and assume that you will have no consequences. And for people for whom Facebook is an important venue for getting their message out and also for fundraising, which it is a really critical piece of as well, I think that is an important signal.
Julie, I think you wanted to speak here too.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with what Faiza just said. And I would like to add that what is extremely important to remember here is also the board saying, as influential users, you do have a right to free expression, but that comes with huge responsibility given the platform that you're using and the platform that you have. And that responsibility includes, of course, not violating the community standards, but more broadly, it includes protecting public safety. And I think that is something that has been missing from the conversation until I mean, that wasn't addressed by the platforms until now. And this applies to not only the former President Trump here, but could apply to other very famous leaders who have been gaming the system, you know, these loopholes to spread whatever they wanted with total impunity. And I would say also, in my view, it empowers users that have less power, obviously, you know, the regular user, because as it was reminded at the beginning of this discussion, we are now taking also content that has been left up on the platform. So as a user, if you are seeing something that maybe the board or even Facebook doesn't see, because we have to remember that Facebook understands, and particularly its automated content moderation system, they understand very well English, French, and many other languages, but they don't understand all of them. And there's a lot that goes under the radar. So if you as a user who speaks or reads another language, you feel like something is wrong, that a head of state or a very influential user is spreading and violating potentially community standards, you have a way to appeal to the board. And that, I think, is quite, quite important.
Julie, you just muted, but we heard just for the last words, but we got you. We are now out of time. I'm so sorry that we had so many fantastic questions that were submitted that we were unable to get to, but the conversation continues. So I just want to thank the members of the Facebook Oversight Board who joined us, John, Hinaldo, Julie, and Jamal, and also to Faiza and Henry for their fantastic comedy. And thank you, commentary, and thank you to you for your questions and your attention, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.